All right, so for the last thing of the day here, I wanted to make it a lot more interactive. So I do have a crib sheet of some questions to ask our expert panelists, but I'm kind of hoping that you guys will come up with some stuff anyway. And we can do all of yours. So if you have a question, please raise your hand or something. Jeremy is going to come around with a microphone so we make sure we get it captured on film as well, so that the folks watching along or following along at home will have an idea of where the question came from or what it was. Rather than introduce our panelists myself and do a terrible job of it, I would like to ask them to introduce themselves, just a little bit about kind of what their focus is, what they're working on, and do a little bit about what we are. The panel itself is meant to be focused around data literacy and just kind of general data practices, but we also have a fair amount of data ethics expertise on the panel. So any data ethics questions are also fair game. So I guess we'll start with Laura, since you have a microphone already. Go ahead and introduce yourself and let us know a little bit about what you're working on.
Okay, my name is Noreen. I live in Southern California, and I work for a cybersecurity company where I'm the director of research. Most of my research at the moment is around employee data and how we can protect it and how we can still offer companies really excellent cybersecurity. And before I did this role, I was at the Center for Data Science at NYU, where I inaugurated our first Ethics for Data Science class at the master's level, which was actually offered in applied statistics. Statisticians were ready for ethics in a way that data scientists weren't, at least not at NYU. So that's kind of what my background is, and my PhD is in social science. So I have a social science background, and I've spent the last, 5 years doing data science, which is a little more quantitative. That's me.
Hi, I'm Mo. I'm at Data for Democracy, specifically running the Global Data Ethics Project, which Lisa gave a nod to earlier. It's a project that was conceived in kind of a coalition, multi-stakeholder environment between Bloomberg, Bright Hive, Data for Democracy, and hundreds of data scientists that were trying to create some community-generated consensus about what was salient or important in data science within data ethics. So obviously things came up about bias, fairness, openness, transparency, and those things were heavily discussed. I think one of the most valuable parts of this was that we created a community of data scientists from a variety of industries, nonprofit, corporate environments, students, that were talking about data ethics and how it applied to their work, which generates, honestly, a lot of case studies, a lot of discussion. If we're talking about tech literacy, there's also ethical tech literacy as well, where when somebody's talking about privacy, what do they mean? What does somebody else mean when they're talking about privacy? And that's what I do now. So.
Awesome, thank you. And I'll introduce myself again just for completeness. My name is Patrick McGarry. I'm the head of community. I work at data.world. We've already spoken a little bit about data.world, but I'm also leading the datapractices.org movement. So really trying to make a vendor-neutral community of practice. And for those of you that have already checked it out or are going to check it out, expert practitioners, we really want more of those folks to get directly involved as contributors. The courseware and the values and principles, these are all meant to be kind of fungible and are meant to be living documents and grow with the community. And so we need expert practitioners that will weigh in on things like datapractices.org or the Global Data Ethics Pledge or any of those other sorts of community-oriented things. They only get better with more people involved. So that's kind of what I've been working on lately. So I think we'll jump right in here, and I would love to get some of your different viewpoints, and kind of especially as your careers have evolved or unfolded, or the different projects that you've worked on. How do you think data as a practice, we've seen how computer science, engineering, that sorts of disciplines have evolved over time. What would you say are kind of some of the biggest things that have happened in data practice or data science over the last, 5 years or so, that you think are notable and should be, helped along and continued, or maybe things that are awful that should be discontinued?
So I think one of the most interesting things, so when I was helping with the global data ethics principles, I specifically was part of the responsible communications group, which looked at how the public was looking at data and the power of data. And one of the things we talked about was capacity building. I think one of the things that has evolved is this ability for data scientists to take so many different types of data and start doing analysis and merging and extracting meaning from many different types in a way that is impressive and formidable. But when we talk about how the public may view something like privacy, there has to be some capacity building, I think, on both sides about what both people are talking about when we're talking about this kind of analysis of data and many, many, many types of data as it relates to one person or an entire community of people. And so I think that's been the biggest advancement as it relates to this.
So I sat in academia before this. So one of the things we did was look at when it was that academia switched on to data science. And I'm not going to get into the debate of who called it data science first. You can read about that online. But in terms of who started minting these master's degree programs, which is where data science mostly started, that was about, it sort of started in 2011. It really started accelerating in 2012. And now almost all schools have somehow cobbled together. They've been able to hang a shingle and put some faculty they already had under that shingle and call them data scientists. And if they're smart about this, or at least maybe savvy is a better term, they're making money by selling master's degrees. And that is one part of what it takes to become a profession. There has to be some kind of training pipeline that's robust and replicable. But one of the things that comes later in the professionalization process for anything to become a profession are things like professional standards, like what is it that we allow data scientists to do, like what does a good data scientist do, and what are some things that data scientists really shouldn't be in the practice of doing. So that's one of the things that I would say is still, I mean, there's competing codes of ethics. People who are savvy about this are like, oh, let's write one so that it works for us. And we're still in the process of getting to a place where there is one, set of standards for behavior that all data scientists should be expected to agree to. The EU would like to really own that part of it.
Although that reminds me of one of my favorite comics of all time. It's a 3-panel comic, and it's a couple of users are standing around and they're saying, wow, there are 15 competing standards. That's awful. That's terrible. We should fix that. We're going to write the one standard to rule them all. And the third panel is there are now 16 competing standards. So, obviously there has to be some consensus, and it's hard to get there. So you spoke about training and kind of learning, and I want to kind of dive a little bit deeper on that, and especially coming from a very, I'll call it non-traditional educational pathway, and sitting next to someone who is deeply ensconced in academia, I would love to hear your various opinions on, what are some of the things that can lead you into data science, or what are the things that you need to, or that you have experienced that helped you on that journey? Like, coming from academia, what are the things that I should focus on? Are there classes I should take? Are there internships? Maybe looking at non-academic sort of pursuits, what sort of mentorships or other sorts of things should I look for as someone who is aspiring? Maybe I'm a coder, maybe I'm a brand new student. Like, what are the things that you can use to become more data savvy?
So I definitely come from not a traditional data science background. When I started to get involved with data, there were not the data science master's programs. I'll say the way that I think, so two things. Like, I think everybody learns a lot from experience. I think a lot of these kind of data science for social good organizations, Data for Democracy being one of them, others being like Code of America or DataKind. We have people that participate in both organizations within Data for Democracy, are one way that if you're able to work on a particular project, and then also I think asking for mentorship within that, if you're an aspiring data scientist, is really important. There's pluses and minuses to that. I think you can get it really, really involved that's how I got involved in data ethics in particular, because it was something that was very important to me. My background was in public health, where of course I worked with like Excel spreadsheets and then was trying to figure out what to do next. And I think that diversity of background allowed me to come into data ethics with a slightly different perspective that's valuable. Sometimes I miss the fact that I didn't have like a specific like thesis advisor, and there were some kind of mistakes along the way. But I don't know. How is academia?
Well, I'm not going to speak for my own path because I'm not sure it's replicable. But I will, but I have hung out with a lot of master's degree students. I think a lot of people, and this is, I don't mean to be rude, but I think a lot of people come to data science because you can make money doing data science. And that's like a legitimate reason to follow a career path, I think. Right. Sure, but it's been interesting to watch what happens when that is, if the majority of the people entering your space, your academic space, are motivated by that. It seems to correlate highly with, I'm not claiming causation, that those types of students really want the most methods possible. Like I want NLP, and I want, adversarial, I want GANs, they want method. When we try to hire people, and now that I sit on the other side, if they have like a smattering of all the methods, like a scattershot approach to that, it's really not that compelling. We don't really know what to do with those folks. We usually don't need all of the methods all the time. So I would maybe encourage people to specialize a little, especially if they're passionate about something. It's just easier to be good at something you really care about. I don't know. The data science environments that I spent time in had a kind of macho, like, my methods are harder than your methods. And that's a really strange achievement because it doesn't really translate into getting hired.
Excellent. That sounds like practical experience is what it distills down to in both cases. So,
and being able to translate what you've done.
Right.
Like if your methods are so complicated you can barely explain them in any language that's spoken, it's going to be tough.
Yeah, can I add one to that? I think the other thing too, and this might be a little bit of a hero's journey, is if anybody wants to get involved with documentation projects or open source, I think that's also a great way to learn how to communicate about things, and also just a really, really valuable thing in terms of thinking about the stewardship of data practices and technology as a whole.
Excellent. And I will remind the audience that without your questions, you will be continued to be subjected to my questions. So I would encourage you to put your hands up so you can actually have things answered that you care about. Please do. If you have questions, raise your hand. Yes, that's what I like to see.
I'd like to hear some advice on how do you stay relevant and keep up if you come from the prior era, before a few years ago, where there were master's programs in data science. How do you cope with those macho guys?
We need some drinks. It's probably, so as a practical matter, aside, drinking is probably not the answer. I mean, water maybe. But we have a lot of people who do traditional software engineering, software development roles for us. If you can kind of move yourself in the direction of the data infrastructure, that's probably a gentler entree where you'll still, all of the skills that you have as a software developer are still going to be highly relevant. And that might be one way to do it. There are tons and tons of online resources. Some of them are very, very good. Andrew Ng has a class through Coursera that's an amazing intro, and he's added to that series. So there are some things you can do without sort of quitting your day job or taking a bunch of time off. I had a colleague whose idea was, okay, to address this problem, we should have some sort of certification. So even if you don't have time to quit your life and go to a master's program or pay for one, you can at least prove that you have the skills. That may be still happening, but I think none of the schools actually wanted that to happen because it would put them out of a job. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think also, okay, so like my name that my parents gave me was Maureen, and I was called Mo a lot of times growing up, and it was kind of switched back and forth. As I've moved into technology, increasingly I'm Mo, because I think there is, I mean, like, we can't ignore the disproportionate privilege of being male in technology. I think when we're talking about kind of opportunities and being able to find mentors and be assertive, and I'll just say, like, in a very vulnerable way, Mo I love, but I partially use it because as I've moved into technology, it's been useful to have a gender neutral name. That's you know, we can talk more about inequality and equity over drinks, including water, but I think it is an interesting comment, so.
And in terms of staying relevant, just from my own background in looking at open source and a very meritocratic sort of approach to problem solving, is that some of the best advances in individual careers that I have seen are people that have made space for themselves by jumping onto a project that they cared for deeply. Even if they didn't have necessarily the technical chops to really strongly advance the project on their own, just getting in there and taking a, I'll do whatever I can, you know, I will mop the floors kind of approach, right? So writing documentation, writing test cases, like whatever those sorts of things are, those people advance their skill levels faster than other people, even those that were going back to school. Just getting in and doing and steeping themselves in the culture.
Yeah, plus one to that.
So you're also talking about like paths towards data literacy and paths towards careers in data science, but it seems like there's so much of the value of data literacy is important for us as a society, and especially people that perhaps like won't necessarily fall into that track academically or even professionally. So do you all have a sense to what extent data literacy is going to be taught in curriculums in like a high school or even a younger level?
I'll jump in that while you guys are thinking. So that's a really hard question to answer. You know, there are definitely people that we've worked with as an organization, data.world, where they are starting curriculum for children, you know, younger ages, but also just more broadly, curriculum for anyone and everyone. I mean, that's part of what we did with datapractices.org, which was just, let's get in there and create courseware for anyone that wants to level up on their ability to work with data or even just understand it. I think the hard part comes in making it, well, it's just like solving this as an organization, right? Making data a central part of your day-to-day business decisions is very hard, especially for organizations that weren't engineered that way. We love to throw out examples like Facebook and Google and Airbnb and Warby Parker and whoever else. You know, these were companies that were engineered from the ground up to be data-driven. And you know, you look at some of the older companies or companies that have people that are, they may be new companies, but maybe their leadership hasn't been steeped in data culture. You know, we're talking about the same problem, which is making data a language that is spoken across the organization or across the community or whatever. And I saw a really interesting talk at a conference recently, the Gartner Data and Analytics Summit, by a woman named Valerie Logan, who was talking about data as a second language, really thinking about it just like you would think about English as a second language, or you know, learning French or German or Italian in high school or whatever, thinking about data as a language that you are using because you are expressing ideas and information in a particular lexicon that is not necessarily something that everyone understands. So, you know, I think taking that sort of approach and thinking about being multilingual as data has to be much more ubiquitous before we can even think about doing specific things. Like the idea of data literacy needs to be broader.
I think we're a ways away from K through 12, except that statistics is really the beginning of data science, and some schools do that really well. A lot of schools don't. I think statistical reasoning is really hard for a lot of people. So that's kind of the first hurdle. I dabble a little bit in K through 12 circles, and I haven't really heard anyone getting excited about data science. They're still really working hard to try to find ways to teach coding, and a lot of the instructors at that level don't really know the difference between coding and data science, and maybe at some level it's not important to try to hammer that home with them. Just more statistics might be nice.
Yeah, someday someone will explain to me what a p-value is, so.
Yeah, second on statistics. I'll also just say that as these, I think, well, some of these online programs, I think, will do, if there's space for different schools to allow students to engage in them, will do kind of amazing things, again, if there's space for the inequality between, for instance, urban schools that are well-resourced and more rural schools that may not even have some basic science education due to just lack of ability to recruit teachers that have science degrees or coding degrees or data science degrees. And so I think like kind of pushing, even calling your legislator and asking for policies that allow for the schools to have space for that. I mean, I think there's probably a space for data scientists to volunteer at different schools. I know that when I was in high school, I volunteered with 4th and 5th graders to teach robotics, and it was like basic coding, and that was the only space for them during that day. So I think it has to be like a really like almost like citizen-driven effort if this is something that we want to see in the future generations. And I'll get off my activist horse for now. So.
Well, if I can ask you to, let's get the microphone.
If you wouldn't mind getting back on your activist horse for a second.
Always, just.
I guess in a lot of the talk about ethics, the notions of data getting into privacy issues or bias issues, I wonder if you're creating a tool that has a lot of power in terms of being able to uncover information about people, something that might be used for, say, combating human trafficking or child porn, but at the same time, in kind of in the wrong hands, could be used for a lot of nefarious purposes. How does one prevent that? How does one,
So let me talk about my pre-data science as a field days. So I used to work in public health, and so public health works with data to effectively get resources to people that need it. It often deals with data that carries a lot of unfortunate stigma with it, and could potentially be with vulnerable populations. I worked on a project when I was doing public health about HIV-positive individuals who lack the resources to get medications. That is data that in the hands of the wrong people could cause problems. There are regulations. There are doctors that are trained not to do this. There are public health that have a code of ethics that is also similar to what the doctors do. So there's this kind of conversation and culture of privacy and understanding that people shouldn't be exposed, their HIV status shouldn't be exposed, that I think can be built and transferred over as we're trying to figure out what a code of ethics for data scientists look like.
I'm thinking a lot about that. That's probably what I think about most of the time. I don't have great answers for that, but I like where Mo's going with this, which is the data doesn't exist in a vacuum. It exists in certain contexts, and you're very well aware that in context A, in use case A, good things happen, and in context almost anything else, in use case who knows what, bad things could happen, really damaging things could happen, and data happens to because it's so cheap and easy to copy, it persists for you can persist longer than you do. So the consequences are really creepy. We're thinking about how to do, rather than something like the right to be forgotten, which assumes that you, an empowered individual, know how to go to some corporation and get them to forget some things, which you then just have to kind of trust that they did. That's interesting. And it might work okay with some corporations, and then others you might not trust to even get that right. We're working on trying to develop protocols where the data that we think is the most privacy sensitive or empowerment sensitive, because I think what we really talk about when we're talking about privacy is actually empowerment. We want to have agency over these things that are sensitive about us. It's not so if it's not a big deal that you know that I'm a woman, I don't really care. If it's a big deal, then I want to have power over that. So it's not really about privacy, it's about power. So we're trying to set up protocols where things just decay by design so that we don't have to rely on very empowered, intelligent, healthy individuals who are going to come to us and say, hey, company, could you please forget this stuff because I decided I'd like to take some agency for myself here. And we'll just say okay, we know that some of this stuff is really privacy sensitive, and at least in our case, we say, is it really necessary for cybersecurity to know that you emailed your mom yesterday? Maybe, right? Because it's cybersecurity. Maybe that's just your mom, and you're emailing all the sensitive data to your mom. But once we can determine that that's, nothing nefarious has happened, maybe we can go ahead and decay some of the stuff that's the most privacy sensitive. But that's that's an approach that I haven't really heard anyone else talking about. It's like a advanced GDPR, advanced right to be forgotten, is to actually go ahead and say, well, we're going to go ahead and forget some of the most sensitive stuff. Is it going to be terrible for an HIV positive person who might need to get access to medication? Yeah, maybe, I don't know. But I was from New York, where the DACA registrants were, yeah. So we can collect that data again if we got it in the first place. Maybe it's okay to delete sometimes.
Yeah, and I think we're in a position right now where the industry doesn't even know what it knows, to the point where they don't even know what they don't know. Like, they haven't even reached step 2, right? They're still, you go to some of these conferences or you talk with some of the industry leaders. I'm not talking about data forward type people, the industry leaders who are deciding corporate policy or maybe developing international policy, whatever it is. Like, these folks don't understand what the state of the art is even, let alone where that's going, right? And so I think we're in a really difficult spot, and it shows in the talks that are given, in the conversations that happen in these boardrooms, which is a lot of the people who are in charge or leading the way are saying, don't worry about it, just keep kind of doing what you're doing, gather as much data as you can, it'll be useful down the road, you'll figure it out. There's no real, here's the roadmap, which is dangerous, right? Because there's all of this data that's being gathered and sometimes used ineffectually or maybe deliberately, deviously, I'll say. It'll be a nice word to use. And so I think that's the problem, is like we haven't even reached the level of sophistication where we can address these problems because most people aren't there.
The other thing I think that is just interesting in this landscape is that data for good projects are not by default ethical data use projects. And I'm always really, I'm interested, so for instance, I think when Facebook has had all their privacy apology tours, they've mentioned that ways that Facebook has been useful. So I used to live in Peru, and I happen to know there were a lot of floods in Peru, and a lot of people were using Facebook data to make sure that certain populations were served or identified as being, affected by these floods that happened a couple years ago. And they used that in their kind of marketing deck for see, our data that we collect is useful for a lot of people. And you're like, okay, cool, that was a great story. What are you doing now with the ethics of it? It was used for one good thing. What else has it been used for? And so just I think even when you work on data for good projects, thinking about the ethical data use, that publicly available data is there. It doesn't mean you should use it in certain ways that could be harmful towards somebody or helpful, right? There's this duality of availability of data.
Or it could even just establish a practice hey, we're sharing data we're not really supposed to share, but we're doing it for good. And then all of a sudden sharing that kind of data becomes acceptable. Or we scraped the hell out of the web. Awesome. And then we did this good thing with it. And now all of a sudden web scraping is oh yeah, you can totally just do that. And it's fine. It's no big deal. So yeah, I am kind of on the sometimes this data for good stuff is used as a smokescreen to distract you from crap that's going on over here, or to establish behavioral patterns that really need to be considered a little bit more carefully.
Other questions?
Talking stick. I'll put a vote in for K-12. I'm really concerned about people getting out of high school and not having some basic literacy and sort of bullshit filters. It makes me worry about our culture and democracy as it is, or as it's going. I just had a talk with a company that one company got bought by another, and then got bought by another. We were talking to them as a wrap-up in a project, and I asked about, what are you going to be doing in the future with your new merged company? And they said, we have information up to 300 data points on 170 million Americans. And I started thinking, okay, this is a company that no one's heard about probably. Most people have never heard about. And I realized there's a lot of money to be made for buying and selling data, right? And there's data repositories about all of us, who knows where. So we don't even know who to go to, and I'm starting to think GDPR is maybe it's not enough. So how could you possibly get our arms around this kind of stuff?
Is that company based in California?
No, they're based in New York.
But they probably do business with people in California, right?
Yes, they do.
Probably. Well, the good news is the California Consumer Protection Act is aimed specifically at data brokers. It still requires this like empowered individual to go say, hey, stop selling my data. Like A, what is it that you think you know about me? And B, either correct it or stop selling it. Again, I'm a little skeptical about this empowered consumer who's out there figuring out unknown companies that, to go demand their data rights. But at least we're moving in the direction of trying to write into our regulations that that kind of behavior has some consequences. There's also some breach penalties written into that. So if you're, I don't know, company X in New York, isn't very good at protecting their valuable data, which you'd think that people would be, but no, I work in cybersecurity. They're terrible at it. Please lock your Amazon S3 buckets down better. If they lose it, they could also be subject to decent fines, but nowhere near GDPR. So we're moving in the right direction. It would be great if more people had data literacy, but really it's also capitalism literacy to understand where to push for these kinds of things. And it's probably not in empowering individual consumers, because that still leaves a lot of gaps. How do you even know who has your data in the first place? You don't.
Yeah, I think the other thing too that I'm realizing, and this is kind of from getting into ethics a couple years ago and being super idealistic and maintaining that idealism, and also knowing the solutions are going to be complex, messy. Some will happen at the county level, some will happen at the state level, some will happen at the international level, and just kind of acknowledging or figuring out like where your piece of data or tech literacy lies, and then pushing for change there is kind of what I encourage anybody within like the Data for Democracy community to do, just because people do come from across all 24 time zones. And then telling somebody about it, like building coalitions, like getting collaborative action, knowing where like the decision makers are on this and who cares and why. That's the capitalism literacy I think you're referring to as well. And I think that's just really important all around.
Nice. All right, as people think of more questions to ask, oh, great, we got another one right here.
So a lot of this conversation around like GDPR and CCPA has been about like, we want to be, as a company, I want to be transparent about the data that I'm capturing about you. But to a certain extent, I think, as Laura mentioned, like it's not really about the data itself. It's about sort of, it's about what are the decisions that I'm making about you as a customer that is based upon this data, which sort of really gets into like the weeds of like, if I'm training a recommender system, what is the objective function that I'm using? If like, think of in terms of YouTube, like, because you viewed this video, this right-wing video, now I think you're like a paranoid, right-wing conspiracy theorist, so I'm going to show you like this random smattering of, videos. And so, but really what I'm trying to do is, as a company, I'm trying to like increase your view time on YouTube or whatever. And so it really is about, I think, comes on to like, how is it that I'm using your data? But I think coming back to the data literacy piece, people don't often know what the data even means. And like when you look at sort of, for example, Google Takeout, there's not a whole lot of clarity even in the data, let alone like, sort of making the decision-making process very transparent. And so when you think about like the ethics around it, and when you think about sort of like, the transparency around it, how do you think that process of this data is being used to make these decisions about you, and this is how we're judging you as an individual, how do you think that can be more transparent for a population like the average, person who is not the most data literate?
I think about that too. Privacy policies in terms of service are probably not a great model because nobody reads them, and if you try to read them, they don't really make any sense. So we're trying to develop, so transparency probably works best if the thing that is relevant happens right in the moment that it's relevant for that user, consumer, citizen, whatever status they might have. So if right in the moment that they're watching a video, YouTube is like, hey, we're showing you this because you watched this previous video and you have a history of watching a lot of videos between midnight and 2 a.m. and it's, lo and behold, 12:15. So you're on a binge. We're going to send you down this path. That's really relevant information right at that moment. If they were to come across that at some other moment, not so relevant. So, to the extent that you can design transparency and so it happens in like little bite-sized bits right at the most relevant moment, and that there's some actionable item that's like, if we would have randomly recommended the most popular video in your county, it would have been this, but instead we gave you this. Then you kind of have presented them with an A/B choice. Now, I'm not good at recommender systems, so there's probably like 29 problems with what I just said, but that kind of design where you're kind of trying to bite-size the transparency and bake it into the way that someone is using this. So, for instance, in a privacy, like let's say you're particularly, you work for a company that reads your Slack messages. FYI, it's really easy to do that. So you should maybe ask your company if they're reading your Slack messages if it's unclear. But it would be really nice, maybe not the very first second you onboard, because when someone gets onboarded, they're bombarded with sort of things, but like 3 days later to be like, oh, by the way, we wanted to remind you of this policy. We're going to go ahead and read your Slack messages. That's just the way it works here. We also have endpoint detection in place, so whenever you send an attachment, we know X, Y, and Z. Here's a way to avoid that, and also here are things that you can't, because you work here, you can't avoid it with these types of communications, and you kind of let them know where the bumper guards are, things like that. Bake right into the moment when they're using it. Obviously, most of these platforms aren't designed that way. Slack doesn't have a little, like, oh, your CEO just popped into this, is pulling this stuff off the API right now and checking out what you're doing. That's probably not going to happen. But if that's the dream state that I'd like. So if you happen to have a platform that you can design those kind of transparency right in the moment when someone wants it, is a cool way to do it.
Yeah, and I think also when we're, 100% agree, because we're all going through our daily lives being pinged with so many things, and I might see something that I want to change, like Facebook. I don't want to see what this person is showing me anymore. I don't change it in the moment. I see it again. I can change it. I mean, all these kind of daily decisions that build up and create a decision fatigue are definitely, this is really relevant. I think the other thing too is it's not just data literacy anymore, it's algorithmic literacy. I'll have friends ask me, they're like, I went to run a 5K and I was looking up shoes to run a 5K on YouTube, and a month later they're only showing me marathon videos. And I think that like push for recommendation engines to show more and more content that keeps you there is both kind of a data ethics issue and kind of just a community, we should be aware of this issue, which is slightly different than just focusing on just data, but algorithms, how you interact with them. Probably somebody mentioned UX a little bit earlier, and I think that's an important methodology to think of too when we're thinking about these things.
Other questions?
Keeping it very healthy, Jeremy.
Keeping the ethics question going in social media and going with the largest company right now with their way their algorithms are driven by engagement, not necessarily content, and how they're also turning to the government for support now, possibly. I was kind of interested in things that you're interested in watching that occur, hopefully developing capacities, as well as action steps that you'd like to happen. Sorry, that's a large topic.
Yeah, so one of the things I'm kind of, I'll mention one thing. I think maybe we can talk about this within a US context and kind of like agency and laws and stuff we have here. One thing that concerns me about social media kind of globally is that oftentimes Facebook is the first thing that arrives somewhere in a country that's developing basic infrastructure with the internet. So while I view the internet as a place where people can become data literate and technology literate and algorithmic literate and learn things, the fact that they can create a monopoly on something decreases our power as users or citizens within a particular country to enact the type of change or ask for different changes in what they do. And I think that's a kind of a huge, we can talk about what goes on in the US, but I think it's a huge ethical issue when we're thinking about how we regulate Facebook. How do we also do it internationally too?
I think Facebook is actually being used as in the social psychological role of a scapegoat right now. There are many companies that are doing funky shit, pardon my language, with data. And to your point, we haven't heard of most of these companies because they're small, and we probably wouldn't have heard of Cambridge Analytica. So what is the problem with that? Well, if you go back to your social psych, when you focus on a scapegoat, usually you're worried about overly stigmatizing that particular group of people or company or whatever it is. In this case, I'm worried that we're designing our regulations to work for companies like Facebook and not to necessarily work for all the other companies that are doing this. So the right to be forgotten is a really good example because you know you have a relationship with Facebook. You don't know you have a relationship with all these other, I don't know if I have a relationship with Cambridge Analytica. I don't know. So I can't go there and say, please forget me, because I don't even know. And so I'm a little concerned about the way that the conversation is, just a steady drumbeat of I hate Facebook, Facebook did this, Facebook had that problem, because it really focuses our attention on just one company that has one particular kind of business model, and it distracts from other kinds of things. So I heard that someone in the audience, I'm sorry I missed it because I would have cheered, brought up employee data. We really aren't talking about that. CCPA doesn't cover it, GDPR doesn't really do a whole lot with it. But that's a big deal. All of us, spend probably most of our waking hours at work. And the capacity to capture our behavioral data is technically not so special that that it's unique. We don't talk about that very much. So I'm happy to do the drumbeat of why we don't like Facebook's practices, but I would love to hear about some other funky practices just to keep the conversation wide enough so that when we do go to regulate and figure out how to be activists, good activists, we're keeping the data science surround in mind. And we're not, it's interesting, journalists do, I follow them a lot. They have kind of their 5 favorite companies to talk about, and then that's it.
Although to that end, and to extend this discussion, and that the Facebook is that negative drumbeat, and I feel like the only time we hear about these practices are when we hear about the funky practices, the people that are doing questionable things. So I would like to hear both of you. Who are some people that are doing it right? Who are some folks that we could hold up as doing it well? And I realize that we are in a very Wild West sort of setting with data. Data is an open landscape. It's green field. There's so many different ways and so many different things that we could do. I'm curious, have you seen examples of people that are treating their data appropriately, and more importantly, treating the people that data is about appropriately? That to me is a hard question. I can't really think of a lot of people that are doing it right that you can hold up as examples.
First of all, yeah, and thank you for actually reminding me included that Facebook isn't the only one, because sometimes I have so many conversations with people in kind of the data science community that I agree with you, it does function. As far as doing things right, so I suspect some company, it depends, doing right about which data. So I think some companies that have a particular business to consumer relationship, they're probably treating some of that consumer data with a high degree of integrity and privacy. I also think some companies maximize for one type of kind of ethical output. We've seen Apple do this in their recent marketing on privacy. So it was effective for me. I now own an Apple phone. Not pushing them, don't work for them, but just saying that I think companies are probably, some of them are probably maximizing one aspect of ethical data use, and the easiest one to talk about right now is often privacy. But one company that's astoundingly good, I don't know. Do you?
Well, I would say this will be kind of a first. I think financial services companies know that their brands are rooted in trust, and they've actually been pretty good at not getting breached. And to some degree, at least when you can see you have a relationship with this company, that puts them in a spotlight in a way that if your data are breached, you have no idea where that stuff goes. So I would say that there are a lot of companies that are doing a lot of things well in terms of sometimes security and privacy really, really are just like two fingers crossed. So making sure your data doesn't wander off into the dark web, we should all be very happy about that. And we're not here. Like two-factor authentication, that started happening in financial services more widely than other, like that's probably where you saw it first, I'm guessing, as consumers. And to some degree, so some of the secure messaging that you see through hospital systems was also put in place to really try to at least keep your data, keep patient data within the hospital where it was collected so it doesn't go wandering off just to who knows where. So there are some great practices out there. It's not all doom and gloom, but I would imagine that Mo and I are probably sitting in a similar position. People don't usually want to come up and tell me what they're doing with data because you walk around with the ethics hat. Nobody wants to talk to you about their data practices because nobody's sure. Like they're all kind of like, I don't really know. I'm not sure.
Yeah, and I will say, I think one thing with the word that you brought up, two words, relationship and trust. And I don't really have fully formed thoughts on it, but I'm increasingly interested in the ways that a company's relationship with a community that affects whether they'll be successful or not actually has an impact on the way that they handle our data. Talking about financial institutions, I'll share a personal story. I come from a smaller town. The local bank there decided to pull out of the subprime mortgage crisis before it happened, in part because the head of the bank, who was the husband of my German teacher in high school, knew a lot of the people that would have been affected by these kind of negligent practices. That's slightly different than something like data ethics, but it has to do with that trust and relationship of him and knowing that his community would be harmed. The larger that a company gets, I think they have a harder time when they're implementing decisions to actually consider kind of the impact of them. So.
Nice. All right. Well, we are running towards the end of our time here, so I think I would just like, as a parting thought, all right, you are now monarch for a day. I would like to know what one thing in data science, data practices in general, what would you say is the most important thing going forward? What would you change or enhance or improve or whatever? What is the thing that you care about deeply in data practices going forward? Anything. Wide open field.
I'm going to give a weird answer. I think that the most important thing we can focus on a society for anybody to have data literacy or technological literacy later on in life, to have that empowerment, is actually early childhood education. So using the data that we know about young people's brains between the ages of 2, actually connecting that to policy to make sure that those people, those children, have the best possible care and practices necessary so that our society can move forward and actually kind of really, really engage deeply with some of these ethical, technological, generational questions we have.
I just wish people would stop hoarding data. I don't mind if you collect it because you know why you want it, what you're going to do with it, the outcome you think it's going to have. If you can articulate those things, at least we can assess what you're up to. But I think data science 1.0, where hoarding was a cool thing to do, I want that to just be over now. Do not hoard should be like our version of do no harm.
Excellent. All right. Well, I'd like to thank our panelists very much. This was a fantastic, fantastic discussion. And thank everyone for coming. I really enjoyed this time, and it looks like we're setting up, but we may be a little bit early. But just to let you know, all of the content that you've seen here today, whether it's the slides, also we've been videotaping all of the sessions, all of this will be made not only available to you as attendees, but to the general public. So if you would like to share this, please feel free to share it far and wide. There will be obviously all of the URLs and things that you've seen today. Please go engage with them, whether it's Data for Democracy. Obviously I feel very strongly about datapractices.org, and many of these other things that are out there. At the very least, like most of the hands that I saw go up when we were asking about who's doing what, it looks like there's a heavy practitioner bent here. So definitely get involved. The biggest multiplier that I see sitting at this nexus between all of these different parts of the data ecosystem is just the more interconnected that we get, the more everyone gets to take advantage of it. Like the same discussions that we were having about open source 10, 15, or more years ago, right? Look at GitHub as an example, right? Open source originally was this horrible, like visceral, no, my source code is for me, I don't share that, that's ridiculous. And now there are billions of reasons in a bank account somewhere that GitHub and the open source movement are definitely doing something well. So I just encourage all of you as practitioners and managers and change agents to help us get there faster. Don't make data go through the waterfall development method. Let's go straight to Agile and straight to getting it right. So, but thank you all for coming today. There's, feel free to stick around for a little while. There's going to be some drinks and munchies and whatnot, and we have the room until 6. I guess I was looking for Jeremy, but they may move us, but follow the crowds. We'll get you there, and I will no longer stand between you and beer. So thank you again for coming.